Welcome to the We All Suffer podcast. This is the second episode in our desert series. I have a new friend of mine, a rabbi and chief officer of awesome at Restoration Seattle church up here. Matt is a Messianic rabbi. He's passionate about sharing the message of Yeshua with his Jewish people and the nations all over the world, beginning in Seattle. He is a thinker, reader, dreamer, and leader among his generation in the Messianic movement. Matt is the author of Jesus Never Said Anything New, which is available probably anywhere, but also you can get it on Amazon. He also serves as a board member of Jewish Voice Ministries International, jvmi.org. Matt and his wife Laura have 3 children and live in Seattle. You guys are going to dig this conversation. Such a cool way we connected. Basically, I'm kicking it at this cafe all the time with some friends, and that's like where I do most of my work. And yeah, someone said you gotta interview Matt for this, and I said okay, cool. And they didn't really connect me with him though, and then I'm talking about him the other day or a couple days later, and a couple other pastors were sitting next to me and overheard me talking about how I'm trying to find this Jewish rabbi, and they were saying, do you mean this Messianic Jewish rabbi, Matt? And I was like, yeah, that's him. And so then they texted me and him on the same group, and it was like boom, boom. And Matt was super kind and has been really awesome to get to know him a little bit. And I think you guys will see why in this episode. We do a deep dive, and this will be a 2-parter. So stick around for the second episode coming out probably a week after this one, and enjoy it. Matt, to start out, I appreciate you coming and being able to talk about this stuff. The first episode with my wife, the intro for this, we talk about how the desert symbolizes sort of this unlearning that takes place with Israelites, the unlearning of Egypt. Like God's taking Egypt out, like helping them get away from Egypt, but also getting Egypt out of them, and then making this new covenant with them, helping them, see that they're the chosen people, choosing them. And there's a transformation. I think we quoted Walter Brueggemann said something about the liminal space and how that's like a transformative thing. So when you think about the Israelites in the desert, if you could like summarize it or outline the Israelites going through the desert, what comes to mind when you're like, this is what that meant, or this is what they went through? Just a couple maybe bullet points, or if you could summarize it, because that's what comes to my mind, is that transformative thing that happens when you're in this liminal space.
Yeah, the desert or the wilderness is an important part of understanding God's presence and the need for his presence. So you have to have times in wilderness where it feels like he's not present in order to understand how meaningful it is when he is present. So, I mean, throughout the narrative, the book of Numbers is actually, in Hebrew, it's Bamidbar, which just means the wilderness. It's called Numbers from Latin because it starts with the number of the people. In my joke is, I'm not very good at math as a rabbi. The only math I do is the book of Numbers. But the name in Hebrew is just the wilderness.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
And what is that? And that's, can you say that again?
Bamidbar.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
Just literally means the wilderness. And it's
that.
walking around, right? They're basically, they leave Egypt, go into the Sinai Peninsula, and then into basically Saudi Arabia, and they're walking around for 40 years and literally following the presence of the Lord. So, they stop at Mount Sinai. They're at Mount Sinai for a year, like at the mountain for a year, and then they travel around for 40.
Right.
So,
and that wasn't maybe the original plan, but that's because
definitely wasn't.
Because they disobeyed.
Yeah. Well, because they're afraid.
Right.
Yeah. A lot of things come down to fear.
Yeah.
And us trying to make our own decisions based on fear because we don't trust what God says.
Right.
And then we end up circling for a number of years before we ultimately do what God said to do all those years before.
Right. No, that's
kind of the pattern.
I like that.
Yeah.
That's a good summary. So, and I like what you said, because I think the fear is a big thing. So if we start in Exodus 13, this is something that reminds me of in verse 17, it says, when Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, though that was shorter. For God said, if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led the people around by the desert road toward the Red Sea. The Israelites went up out of Egypt armed for battle. So sometimes the long way around is because it takes us a little while to get prepared. Is that part of it, you think? Like, what
it's funny, that they leave armed for battle, but the Lord is taking them in a direction to avoid war altogether.
Yeah, that's what I thought was interesting too. It's like they're looking like they're prepared for battle, but God's like, no, you're not ready.
Yeah, and the Philistines have a part of, essentially what is Gaza now. On the actual map of the Middle East is where the Philistines were.
Right. Palestine is Philistine. It's kind of that.
Well, it comes
word.
Later. It's super confusing because
I just know
it's
that
really
word is similar.
The Romans named it Palestine during the Roman Empire.
Oh, okay.
Which is Latin, connected to the region, which is connected to the Philistines. But by the time Rome does that, the Philistines are long gone.
Got it.
So
interesting.
So there's a lot of, but anyway, he's taking them. The road to the land of the Philistines is a direct route from the Egypt. So Goshen, which is where Joseph and his family, the Israelites, start at the end of Genesis, is at the end of the Sinai Peninsula. So that's where the best land in Egypt is. And it's where they raised cattle and did all the things that they did. So if you go from where Goshen was, it's like a direct route to the Promised Land to go where the Philistines were, because the Philistines is part of what God promised to. Their land is what God promised to the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So he takes them a different route because they're coming from slavery into freedom. And in order to take the land, they're going to have to fight a war. So he takes them in a different direction because, if they was right from the Lord's mouth, right? That people might change their minds if they see war and return to Egypt. What's funny is all through the wilderness, they keep saying, let's go back to Egypt. And they treat it like it was good.
Right. Like there was meat there. There was food.
Yeah. The funniest thing is several times it says we had leeks and onions.
right.
Which is like, that's what was good about it, the leeks and onions.
Right.
And they're constantly wanting to go back because even when something is bad, right? If you walk into a wilderness, what you left becomes romanticized, even if it was awful.
Right. Even if it's
like they were slaves for 400 years.
Yeah.
Right? There's nothing. But they were also slaves long enough that generations back, nobody knew any different. Right. So none of them, generationally, they have not experienced freedom at all. When you're a slave, you don't get to choose your schedule. You don't get to choose a day off. You have to do what you're told. So part of the struggle of coming out, being set free from slavery, is now you get to choose what you're going to do.
And there's nobody telling you what to do.
And they have no idea how to even choose because for 400 years, it's like many, many generations, they have no concept of that. So once they get out, right, they're just afraid that the Egyptians are going to come and catch them and kill them anyway. So you come to like the parting of the sea, right? And it's like, well, we're screwed. So
Yeah.
Let's just go back, as if the Egyptians would, one, welcome them back, two, as if the entire 400 years of slavery was a good thing, and they were like safe and they had food, and like none of that is true.
Right. There's like a familiarity to it. It's like, hey, that was easier. Why are we out here? This is harder. We're gonna die here. Why didn't we could have just died there, and at least we were comfortable.
Right. Why would we die in the middle of nowhere?
Right.
Where we could die at least in our homes.
Yeah.
But your homes were slave homes.
Yeah. Right.
Right. That's part of the.
Well, and I think that's like what we can learn from it too. It's like we want to go back to these things that are, enslaving us sometimes, right? Like whether it's sin or whatever, rather than doing it God's way,
right?
Because, even though there's all this nastiness or all this bad consequences of that,
right?
Sometimes we take that because maybe we know, maybe it's familiar, maybe we know. Well, at least I knew what the outcome was going to be when I did that sin or whatever. And I think there's something really crazy and sinister about that kind of thing, about sin, or about trying to go back to something that's familiar that isn't God or isn't God's way.
Right.
It's interesting.
Right. Well, that's the nature of all the way back to the Garden of Eden, is like he gives us very clear instructions, and but what if we do it not that way? And the Lord's like, well, that's not going to go well for you.
Right.
But what if we try it? Well, okay.
Right.
So that's not going to go well for you, So there's actually a form, going back to creation in Genesis 1 and 2, there's an order of the Garden of Eden, which is not a perfect place. This is part of the struggle of convincing people what they think they already know about the scriptures. But if the Garden of Eden was a perfect place, then the snake wouldn't be there. Right?
Right.
It's not a perfect place. It's a different place. Like the plants are watered from the ground. The water comes up and causes them to grow instead of falling from the sky. There's no rain. But it's different, but it's not perfect. So there's a larger area that's called Eden that is
beyond the garden, right?
Beyond the garden. So the garden is really, when you look at the structure of, so in Hebrew poetry, and this is all over the place, but more recently I got this from, it was sort of made much more simple by Tim Mackey at the Bible Project, in a lot of his videos and podcasts and the free seminary classes that they offer. But the idea is everything happens on the top of mountains. The reason why everything happens on the top of mountains is because in the ancient Near East, there's only kind of three parts to the world. There's the sky, which is heaven, the earth, which is the dry ground, and the sea, which is as far away from heaven as you can get. Right? So in the structure of like Hebrew thought and Hebrew poetry, but also in the larger ancient Near East that the Israelites are a part of, it's a totally different worldview. So mountains are naturally the place where heaven and earth meet, because mountains are dry land that go up to the sky, right? So you're closer to God because you're closer to the sky, which is the heavens. So there's this whole concept that is sort of missed for most Bible readers, which is the Garden of Eden is at the top of a mountain. Now, It's not mountains like we have in the Pacific Northwest.
Sure.
Okay, a mountain in the Middle East is basically a hill, right? It's not.
Yeah.
Our context for mountains here in Seattle is like they're not at the top of Rainier at 14,500
It might
feet.
be a couple thousand feet up.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Probably not even.
Okay.
I mean, the Dead Sea is the lowest place on Earth in the Middle East, right?
Okay.
But on the whole world. So, like, their hills are hills. They're not mountains. It's the same as moving. I grew up in New York, Long Island. and we would go to the Poconos, which was the mountains. And then when I moved out here, I was like, the Poconos aren't mountains. Like context is everything.
It matters.
But the idea is any raised land is my wife is from Minnesota and grew up near Fargo, North Dakota. And one of the first times I went to hang with, I think it was after we were married, and they picked us up at the Fargo airport, which is not really an airport. And I mean, technically it's an airport, but it has 5 gates. And we drove up onto the, highway overpass to get to where we were going. And my mother-in-law turned to me and said, "This is the highest point in North Dakota." I thought that was really funny, like the top of a... Okay, because there's no mountains. Yeah. So anyway, everything happens at the top of hills. And the reason is because in the construct of Hebrew thought, when you're higher elevation, you're closer to heaven. So everything's at the top of hills. So the Garden of Eden is at the top of a hill. And then Eden is a larger area that surrounds it. So when Adam and Eve are barred from the garden, they're still in Eden, right? The larger area. Cain and Abel are in Eden. Because
then he gets exiled from Eden. Cain does after that.
So he goes east of Eden.
Right.
And that's sort of the whole structure is there's 3 levels. Garden, Eden, wilderness. Like if you go east,
you're in the wilderness.
That's bad, right? So there's a pattern that everything really follows throughout the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, where going east and into the prophets too, whenever something is mentioned as east, it's probably not good.
Right. Yeah, I've seen that thing.
So even from Egypt, they're going east into the wilderness, and that's always the structure. So the 3 parts end up being, it's actually, if you look at the garden, the larger area of Eden, and the east of Eden, which is the wilderness, there's kind of a 3-part structure to everything. There's the Holy of Holies, the inner courts, and the outer courts of the temple. It's the same, and the temple is put on top of a hill because that's where heaven and earth meet, and the Holy of Holies is the highest part of that on the top of that hill, and there's a 3-part structure. So when you go to Jerusalem, all through the scriptures, you always go up to Jerusalem or you go down to somewhere else. And the reason is because Jerusalem's at the top of a hill. So it's not directional north, south, east, and west. It says up every time you're going into the city of Jerusalem, and when you leave Jerusalem, you go down because you're going down a hill into like from the garden into a larger area called Eden, and then there's a wilderness that we're not supposed to go to. So there's a river. Just stop me if you need to stop me.
This is good. I'm fascinated.
There's a river in the Garden of Eden that outside of Eden splits into 4 rivers. This is all in Genesis chapter 1 and 2. And the 4 rivers basically form what we understand as the biblical world. So they leave from wherever the garden is. And it's the 2 that are named that we're familiar with are the Tigris and the Euphrates. And then the other 2 go into, which is the Nile in Egypt, and then one that goes down to Cush, which is further down south of Egypt. But basically, those 4 rivers they go to Babylon and to Assyria, where Nineveh is, up at the top of the Fertile Crescent, up to Padan Aram, which is where Abraham's family is from, in Haran. So Abraham actually leaves from Ur the Chaldees, which is near Babylon. He goes up the Tigris and the Euphrates to a place called Haran. All of that area is called the Fertile Crescent. And then he goes down from the Tigris and the kind of the top of the Tigris and the Euphrates, which is like modern-day Turkey and Syria. And he goes down into the Promised Land. And then Egypt is northern Africa, so it's part of that area. But that whole world is formed by these 4 rivers that come from the Garden of Eden.
Wow.
So in the understanding, like in Jewish thought, it doesn't matter if it's true or not. It doesn't matter if the math adds up. It doesn't matter if the rivers are in exactly the right place where you want them to be. The whole point of the poetry is there was one river that came where we're from. That river splits into 4 rivers and forms the area where everything in the scriptures happens.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So there's corners that we're not supposed to go to. And the corners that the Israelites are not supposed to go to are Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon.
Oh, right.
So if the promised land, which is a version of Eden, because God provides everything we need in the promised land. So it's kind of getting us back to Eden. And if you go east of Eden, you end up in a literal wilderness in the desert. But you're also heading towards places that we're not supposed to go to get the things that the whole world is getting from Babylon and from Assyria and then below to Egypt. So there's all kinds of places later in the scriptures where Israel is commanded, do not go to Egypt to get chariots and horses. Do not go to Babylon to get gold. Do not go, like, there's this whole list of things.
Yeah,
but it's that whole world is when you go to those places, you're going to those places because you're not depending on the Lord. If you depend on the Lord, then you will stay in Eden. Like that's like that's kind of the whole structure that begins in Genesis 1 and 2 and then plays out.
Yeah.
So,
because it's like, we talk about this in other podcasts, but we were talking about this on the phone when me and you talked about kind of that transposing nature of the biblical story and how you can lay these stories on top of each other and the jazz or the music element of it. It's just playing the same but different, and and there's patterns all over, which is why it's fascinating. And no, I appreciate you laying that out because I didn't know. I don't think I've heard that explained that way.
No, it's super cool. And when you pay attention to those, to like these, Tim Mackey calls them hyperlinks. N.T. Wright calls them echoes. You could look at it as like a melody, different instruments that create a full orchestra together. Like the different instruments make different sounds, but together. So when you start to pay attention to all of those hyperlinks, you read the scriptures different because you start seeing, they're going up to Jerusalem, they're going down from Jerusalem. It doesn't mean what we think it means in English from a Western perspective because it's not written with any of those things in mind. Right. So people that are trying to go back to like Genesis to disprove evolution, Genesis doesn't care.
No, it doesn't.
Genesis is speaking into a world called the Ancient Near East. And what's significant is there are so many things in the creation narrative of Genesis that are just like other creation narratives that we have from the ancient Near East, that we have from Babylon. There's one called Enuma Elish. There's probably the most famous is Gilgamesh. Like, there are these stories that come from those places that Genesis in some places mirrors the same things. But then there's really important changes. Like the first 7 words of Genesis in Hebrew are, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Well, when you go to the other creation narratives, they start with the origin of the gods. They start with where the gods come from. There's chaos in the world. Those gods were born in the chaos, probably from some kind of crazy sexual thing that would be crazy to humans that creates where these gods are birthed out of all of this. Right? They're under the same chaos as human beings are. But Genesis starts with God was already there. And he's the creator of the heavens and the earth. So there's this little word it's 7 words in Hebrew. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And there's this word that doesn't even translate into English, but it's made up of 2 Hebrew letters, which are Aleph and Tav. And it's the middle of the 7 words. And Aleph is the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and Tav is the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So this little word made up of the first letter of the alphabet and the last letter of the alphabet is in the center of 7 words, which is saying in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. But that little word in Hebrew means God created everything from A to Z.
That's awesome.
Like he created the whole. So there's these kind of things
I love that.
It's embedded.
That
it's
pattern.
embedded in the Hebrew, which doesn't translate into any other language. Plus, there's 7 words, and in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, the key words of those first 7 words repeat in multiples of 7 throughout chapter 1 and chapter 2.
Right.
There's 7 days of creation. Like it's so many. There's so many patterns that are intentional.
Yeah.
That some people make it into like weird Bible codes that aren't true because they're not understanding the ancient Near East.
Right. Yeah.
Right?
They want to. We always want to ascribe some.
We're trying to apply it to something that they're not even thinking about.
And
but all of those things create like there's a worldview that they're speaking from, where being with God, walking with God, is like being in a garden.
Right.
When you walk away from God, you're in a wilderness.
Right. Exactly.
But the structure doesn't mean that if you find yourself in a wilderness, you're not in the presence of the Lord.
Sure.
Because the narratives create this idea where in order for the people to really understand their relationship with the Lord, they have to spend time in the desert, because we forget that God is the one that provides everything that we need.
Because if we weren't in the desert, then we would have these things that are provided, but in the desert there's nothing normally. And
we provide for ourselves.
Right.
The battle in the scriptures all the way to the beginning is the relationship between God's will and human will. And we just want to do what we want. And God's like, I like you the way that you are, and you can choose to be in my presence, and I'll give you everything you need. And we're like, yeah, but we want to go and do it ourselves. We want to be like self-made people, right? And that's part of... So when you follow the narrative, you start seeing crazy stuff like, Cain kills his brother, and what does Cain do when he goes east of Eden? He builds the world's first city.
Right.
Well, what do you build a city for? To protect yourself.
Yeah.
Right? For what? Because there's going to be war. Because people are going to attack. Other people are going to attack. So you need a wall, and you got to provide for everything within the wall, and you got to be careful not to go outside of the wall. Yeah. So that city is a false Eden.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And
then cities become places of murder. Why? Well, because the first person to start the first city was a murderer.
Right.
And then you follow the narrative, like his descendant Lamech is actually builds after the flood. He builds the world 6 cities, and 2 of those cities are Nineveh and Babylon.
Right.
So 2 of the world's first cities are built by a guy who Lamech murdered someone, and then he said, if there was a curse on Cain, then it'll be 7 times worse if somebody kills me. And so cities become places of murder and blood. And it's partly why God gives the Jewish people Jerusalem, because Jerusalem is supposed to be Eden, not a city of blood.
Yeah.
But of course, we turn it into a city of blood over and over again, not just us, but everyone.
Sure.
Christians, Muslims, like over history, right? It becomes just like all the other cities.
Yeah.
And that's not God's intent. So that structure of like Eden and going outside of the garden into the larger area and then going even further is part of our kind of...
Yeah.
The goal is to find... is Eden can be anywhere.
Right.
So Eden is when you're walking with God, you're trusting God's voice, you're doing what God says, and you're not trying to provide for yourself.
Right. I love that.
But that's where we all wrestle with.
And that's what he's teaching them in the wilderness. Like, no, I appreciate that example. Let's read Exodus 14 because I want to see what you think about this, because you were just mentioning it But I appreciate all that framing, because I think people don't always know the patterns, and I don't. There's a lot of patterns I still don't recognize. So Exodus 14, the next part of the story, is the Red Sea, and so it says in verse 10, as Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there was the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, was it because there was no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. Moses answered the people, do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only be still. And I love that last line. But it's crazy because just like we said, they immediately start blaming, wishing they were back in Egypt. And there was a kind of an interesting pattern. They talk about dying in Egypt like a bunch. Like, we could have just died, there. Why are we dying? You're going to leave us out here to die.
Right.
There's no graves, here, whatever. Like, there's graves in Egypt, at least. There's a lot of like death and like interesting pattern there. But I think it's God. They're learning to rely on God for like one of the first times in the story, right? And he's just said, hey, you don't need to do anything, just be still. And it reminds me of what you're saying, like God's going to provide. It's not something you need to go worry about.
So check this out.
He's going to fight for
in
you.
Hebrew, the word for fear has the same letters as the word for seeing.
Oh, interesting. So
the reason is because fear happens with what you see with your eyes. So you notice it says you started in verse 10.
Yeah.
It says, when Pharaoh drew near, they lifted up their eyes. And what happens when they see what they see?
They're terrified.
They're terrified. What are they afraid of? Well, everything that just happened, the 10 plagues, the leaving, like the back and forth, the death of the firstborn, like all that stuff is crazy. Yeah. They experienced it all. Like, somehow, all the firstborn of the Egyptians died. None of their firstborn died. When the plague of darkness happened, darkness was everywhere in Egypt except Goshen, where the Israelites were. It was light, and like you could see it, right? You're sitting there going, it looks pretty dark over there, but it's not dark here, right? There's blood in their water. There's no blood in ours. Like, there's frogs all over the place, but we don't have any frogs, right? And the 10 plagues, you go through the 10 plagues, and they're related to different gods of Egypt. Right. And the gods of Egypt, which is all through the Hebrew scriptures, is God does what he does because he's saying to the Israelites and to the people who are their enemies that the things that you worship, do what I say. Right. It's not gods or no gods. Like, he's not even arguing.
Yeah.
He's like, the Assyrians worship a fish god in Nineveh. So Jonah's swallowed by a fish.
Right.
On his way, like, because he runs away. Right. And what is it? It says throughout the book of Jonah, and God appointed the sea monster to swallow Jonah, which if you're in Assyria and you're hearing the story, what that says is, God told our God what to do.
Wow.
Right? So that's part of the narrative, is like they're lifting up their eyes and they're seeing something with their eyes after they've already seen incredible things with their eyes that make no sense except something only the God who created the heavens and the earth could do.
Like the hail, like the fire inside the hail, and the fire god and the ice god. Like
everything.
Those don't usually connect together, but...
Yeah, and they're the gods of the people who are holding them as slaves.
Yeah.
It doesn't make any sense. So then they get out and they come to to water they can't cross. And it's important because they lifted up their eyes and they became afraid. So what does Moses say to them? Don't be afraid.
Right.
Don't trust in what you see with your eyes only, because the Lord just set you free from 400 years of slavery. But they don't know how to, you said it before, which is, a lot of preachers and commentators say he took them out of Egypt, but they still had to get Egypt out of them.
Right.
And that takes a long time.
Yeah.
It takes like 41 years,
Yeah.
right? Because what are they afraid of? They're afraid of, this might not work, because as soon as there's a struggle, as soon as there's something hard that they can't control,
Yeah, they freak
like, how
out.
could we control the water? You can't do that, right? And Moses says, and I think I don't think Moses knows what's going to happen. I think Moses is just like, I don't know either, but
Watch God do something.
let's just see what he does.
Right.
Like, don't be afraid
Right.
of the Egyptians, right? So the literal fire that they're following during the day,
Right, because they already
goes
saw
between
the pillar.
them
Yeah.
and the Egyptians,
Right.
right? Like, God's presence stops the Egyptians in their tracks,
Right.
opens the water, and there's a thing in here where it actually says, it's not like the water immediately splits.
Yeah.
It says that God stirred the water throughout the night. So there's like this really slow parting. So when Moses actually stands up there, it's like the end and holds his arms up with his staff. It's like the end of the water splitting all night.
Oh, wow.
Because that's what the Lord, like, he was kind of doing it all night. So he stops the Egyptians so he can part the water. It's like slowly receding, and then they're able to walk through it. And then that same water crushes their enemies, and they die until we get to the other side. So,
Yeah.
Then you get to the side and you're like, well, that was crazy.
Right.
But then as soon as they get to the other side, somebody's like, but how are we going to eat?
Right. Well, then they do have a song of Jubilee or something first. And but then they go right back to
It's well, like now what do we do?
Yeah.
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 How are we going to eat out here?
Right.
First
it's the water. First it's the
our
water,
stuff's
right?
gonna, like, everything's gonna fall apart.
Right.
Because we're in the desert. What do we do?
Yeah.
Out here now, even though we're talking about the desert is moving away from God's presence, sort of in structure,
right?
Especially with the children of Israel, God's presence is with them in the wilderness. It's not like He sends them out there by themselves.
Right.
Like,
He's always and they're seeing that with the pillar of fire at night.
Yeah, cloud by day, fire by
yeah.
night. Like, they literally see the presence of God in front of them.
Right.
And they're still like,
yeah,
but what do we do for food? And I think Moses is like, I don't know, probably the same God that just killed all the Egyptians.
Right.
We walked through on dry ground and it hit them after 10 plagues and after like all the things. I'm sure He'll take care of the food.
Right. And the water. Like, they're I think it's always, we're so quick to forget is what that makes me think of. Like, God does something, because I think about our life, right?
Right.
God's done so many things for me, but I have to remember that. And there's so many scriptures in Exodus and throughout that are like, remember God did this, even before they leave to when He's like, remember this is the God that did this for you. And I think He's always bringing us back to that because we need to be reminded always.
Yeah,
clearly.
Yeah, so it literally becomes a part of God's name. Yeah, God's name is, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God who brought you out of Egypt with an outstretched arm. Like, after the Exodus, that is God's, like, full name. Right. Because it's repeated that way over and over again. I am the God who brought you out of Egypt. So it's what He does becomes a part of His name. And then when you face things that make you afraid, you're supposed to go back and say, yeah, but we worship the God who brought us out of Egypt with an outstretched arm. And that's part of the narrative, is like, He did that before, He'll do it again if we trust in Him in the wilderness.
Yeah. Let's read Exodus 15, the next part, with before they get to the food, the water is the first thing, right? So in Exodus 15:22, it said, then Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went out into the wilderness of Shur, and they went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. Right. When they came to Marah, they could not drink the waters of Marah, for they were bitter. Therefore it was named Mara. So the people grumbled at Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" Then he cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree, and he threw it into the waters, and the waters became sweet. There he made for them a statute and regulation, and there he tested them. And he said, "If you will give earnest heed to the voice of the Lord your God, and do what is right in his sight, and give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you which I have put on the Egyptians, for I, the Lord, am your healer." And I know there's a lot of words probably in Hebrew there too, because to me, I see that there's some stuff that I'm like, how is this working? Like with what tree is he throwing in to make it sweet? But there's something about God can make the bitter sweet, right? There's a lot of people have talked about that, like that. I think about the suffering and I don't know if that's really what's being said here, but to me that's a strong imagery of like, man, there's a bitterness and God makes it sweet, right? You know, and I think that's beautiful, just metaphor for who God is and what he can turn our suffering into. Yeah. But he's also, testing him here. But somebody said, Brueggemann had a good quote. He said, "At Mara, the call to obedience is set within the context of provision. God's faithfulness precedes the demand for faithfulness in return, showing that obedience is not burdensome, but a response to grace." I thought that was pretty deep, because here God provided for him, even in the midst of their grumbling. And then he's like, "Hey, obey my commandments," right? Which is pretty deep. But what are your thoughts on this scripture? Because I know there's probably a lot going on.
Well, so anytime you see the word listen,
Shema, right?
It's the word Shema.
Yeah, talk about that.
And it's funny. Okay, so the Shema is like the cornerstone of Hebrew thought and liturgy. Like is that prayers and in our services.
Yeah, is there a difference between Shema and Shemet? It's like the prayer is it said the same way?
Shema, yeah.
Okay, so because I know the prayer.
The Shema is Deuteronomy 6 verse 4. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." Yeah. What's interesting is, if you think about the wilderness this way, we're reading them coming out of Egypt on their way to Mount Sinai. Right. The 40 years of the wilderness is after Mount Sinai, because they get to the promised land. Right. And there's an evil report from the 10 spies why? Because they're afraid with what they saw with their eyes.
The fear again, yeah.
And now they have to circle the wilderness for 40 years. So if you look at the structure of the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Bible, Numbers and Deuteronomy are unnecessary books. If we listen to God, right, we don't need those last 2 books. So at Mount Sinai, God gives Moses, it's all of Exodus, it's all the regulations in Leviticus, right, for what we're supposed to do with the tabernacle and what will later become the temple based on the same. It's like, this is all the stuff you do when you get into the promised land. There's the Levites, the tribe of Levi will become priests, and there's this whole system of sacrifice that you're going to do, and it's all in the land. This is how you're going to do it. It's part of, verse 26 of Exodus 15, if you shema the voice of the Lord and do what's right in his eyes, not your eyes, but you do what's right in his eyes. So the word shema in Hebrew, it's like in Deuteronomy in English, it's translated as "Hear, O Israel." Here it's "listen," but it's because in Hebrew the word Shema means listen and obey. Right. In the same action. So, like as a parent, when I say to my children, "I need you to get up off the couch and fill the dishwasher," and they say, "I just need 2 more minutes on my game." Okay, you got 2 minutes, and then I don't want to come back here and say it again. I want you to get up and do the dishes. I come back 10 minutes later, and they're still sitting on the couch, and I say, "Did you hear what I said to you?" Yeah, I heard you, but you didn't do it. Right. So you didn't hear me. You heard me with your ears. Right. But the fact that you didn't obey
Yeah.
means you didn't hear. You're not listening. All of those ideas are in the word Shema.
It's
right?
listen and obey.
So it's listen to what I'm saying and do what I say.
And isn't it double Shema
Chris
here
Tucker,
too?
It's Chris Tucker in
in
Rush Hour. Do you hear the words that are coming out of my mouth?
Yes.
Right. And we hear the words, but we don't do what he says. So it's funny because the Shema gets kind of cemented after the 40 years in the wilderness and after we don't do what we're supposed to do. Then God gives us, then Deuteronomy becomes the cornerstone of everything that's repeated. Everything's repeated. That's why Latin Deuteronomy is second law.
Oh yeah.
Because it's a repeat of why did we need it repeated? Because we didn't do it.
Right.
Now we're going into the promised land, and he's got to repeat everything because that was to a generation that died in the wilderness. Now this is their children.
This is the new generation. Yeah.
Everybody, it has to be repeated.
Yeah.
So that this generation has an opportunity to Shema, which is listen and obey.
And this is the first time they bring up Shema in the scriptures, from what I looked up. This is the first
Exodus.
Yeah, in Exodus, from what I saw.
Well, it's always there.
How do you mean? Like
anytime God says to listen or hear,
right?
I'm fairly certain He says it in Genesis too.
Oh, right. But in Exodus, I think this might be the first time, but I don't know. But
the first time in Exodus.
Maybe. I think it might be.
Maybe.
But
it's not the first time in the scriptures.
Is there something to the? Is it a double Shema right here too in Hebrew? I don't know if you have that, but I feel like I looked it up and it said this was the one he says Shema, Shemoah, like.
Oh, yeah.
Right there. So that's kind of it's like double time.
Yeah, Shemoah, Shema.
Yeah. So he's like really like it's a double emphasis Shema.
Yeah. Yeah, like all you have to do is hear the words that I'm saying and do them. And if you do them, if you do what is right in my eyes, pay attention to my mitzvot, which is my commandments, keep all the things I'm telling you to do, then I will put none of the diseases on you which I've put on the Egyptians, and I will heal you.
Yeah.
So what do they do next? They don't listen.
Right.
What do? We don't listen.
Yeah.
You know, that's it's human nature.
Right.
And it doesn't mean, and this is the struggle for people, like I listened to the first podcast about you and your wife's poop issues, and which I've had my own, actually.
Yeah, we could talk poop anytime you want.
Yeah. And I literally I've had 6 things in the last 9 years. 5 of them were digestive issues. And then the most recent was leukemia last year.
Oh, wow.
It's like the greatest leukemia you can have. It's like the most treatable leukemia.
Oh, okay.
My oncologist was like, if you have to choose leukemia, you chose the best one. I was like, nailed it. But all 6 things that have happened to me in the last 9 years have been, every one of them was weird and not supposed to happen. For like someone my age, it was always, and most of them happen around Jewish holidays. Oh. Now, I'm not saying that this is true for everyone. It's not. And there's some people in the Pentecostal world, which I grew up kind of Messianic Jewish and Pentecostal, that make like every disease is either from God or from Satan.
Right.
And
right.
as if disease doesn't exist in this world and is random. And I think people need doctors. Like you give the disclaimer in your podcast.
Yeah,
like, please go to doctors. Don't. Okay.
Yeah.
But I had, and I just realized a piece just recently, is 9 years ago I had diverticulitis.
Oh, wow.
And I was in the hospital for 5 days. And after, very clearly, I was getting into my car and like the Lord was sitting in the car with me, like another person. I just heard what felt like out loud. I'm the one that made you sick.
Wow.
And it was so like clear, which is not, I do not hear God's voice that clearly often. Out loud, I just said, I don't understand why you would do that to me. And just as clear, he said it was the only way I could get you to listen.
Dang.
It just 9 years later, I just realized a couple weeks ago that that's the word Shema.
Yeah.
So there's all these things that I immediately tried to figure out with my own eyes and my own strength. Like, okay, well, what am I not listening to?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm not listening to my wife on some things, and I'm not listening to my leaders. I've known now that I have narcissistic tendencies.
Mm-hmm.
I've spent the last 5 years in counseling.
Wow.
Trying to figure all that out and damage that it's caused, because it's caused all kinds of damage. And it all started with, it's the only way I could get you to listen. So I burst into tears when the Lord said that. I tried to process what I thought that meant. And then when you hear God clearly, what you end up doing is adding to what he said, or like interpreting what he said, what it really means.
Yeah.
You make decisions based on the interpretation of what you think it means,
Right.
only to find out years later that it didn't mean what you thought it meant, which you can track in the scriptures, right? This is like Abraham
And Sarah.
and Sarah, right? God shows up and says, you're going to have a son. And he's like, awesome. God, that's all he said.
Mm-hmm.
And Sarah's like, well, it's not really possible. So why don't you take my concubine? Who's from where? Egypt.
Right.
Right? Like the amount of times that Egypt and Assyria and Babylon show up in the text.
Well, Hagar
And
Egypt
the back
too.
and forth. That's what I mean.
Hagar is the one. Yeah, I
Right.
forgot that was
right.
her.
Like it's not because she's bad. It's not because Egyptians are bad.
Right.
It has to do with whether you listen to the God of Israel or not.
Right, because then you're
And
going
Hagar's
east.
the first. She's in the
She goes in
runs
the wilderness.
away into the wilderness.
Yeah, and then it flips with
And
it.
she names God, the God who sees me.
Right.
Is Adonai Roeh, which is the word seeing, is all through the Abraham narrative, because they keep seeing with their eyes and making decisions in their own strength.
Right.
So the most classic example that every person who grew up in church already knows, because whether you know where it's from or not, it's Proverbs chapter 3.
Right.
And it is, what verse is it? It's trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding, right? Verse 5. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, lean not on your own understanding, in all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord, which eyes and fear have the same, it's all the same root words. And turn from evil. It will be healing to your body and refreshment to your bones. Like, we all know the verse, right? But to trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding is the nature of fear. It's the nature of what happens when you're in a wilderness season of your life where God's not speaking clearly. Well, my understanding now is I think he's always speaking clearly.
I think he's always speaking. We're not always listening.
I think it's our ability to Shema that's the problem.
Right.
And then being able to wait until he says something, and then letting it sit with what he says. Then you have to let it sit. You know, what if Abraham was like, well, God said we're going to have a son. I don't know how it's going to happen, but let's just wait.
Right.
And see what happens. So it's not till 13 years later that God shows up again and says, no, it'll be through Sarah.
Right.
And Ishmael's already 13 years old.
Right.
And God and Abraham's like, but what about Ishmael? And the Lord's like, well, I'm going to bless him because he's your son. But I never told you to do that.
Right.
Right? So you thought he was the seed of promise. I never told you he was the seed of promise. You made that up. Right? So we cause like all this
all these issues from
pain
not listening
and not waiting.
Right. And not,
so it's listen and obey is Shema.
right.
But then to not lean on your own understanding.
Right. Like Proverbs 3
is the interpretation of what we hear. Like,
right.
So I go back 9 years ago from now, like 5 more health issues since. And what I've found in counseling is, and your wife talked about this in your first podcast, is what I've understood is I made myself sick in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Because I was not understanding my mental health and my emotional health.
Yeah.
And my therapist walked me through somatization, which is the idea that if your emotions can't escape your body in some way, right. your mind pushes the emotions into your body.
Yeah.
And then typically people have pain in areas that connect to very certain things. Like there are certain emotions where my counselor's trying to get me, I say trying.
Yeah.
Because it's been a struggle.
Yeah.
Because I don't really understand how it works. But when when we're talking about certain emotions, his question is, well, where does that show up in your body?
Right.
I don't know where it shows up in my body. It's very frustrating, right? But it's like, because if there's tightness in the chest, or you feel it in the shoulders, or you feel,
right.
like it's all related.
It's all related, man.
So 9 years ago, the Lord said it was the only way I could get you to, I'm the one that made you sick, which I think 9 years ago he had to say it that way because that was against my theology.
Yeah.
You don't make people sick, you heal people. And he's
right.
like, you've been reading the Bible? Because
right. It's in there. It's not in there. And I like how you prefaced it, because it's not always that, but it can be that. It depends on, he'll use what he needs to use to get us our attention. And the way I think about it is like, well, because he's a loving father and he'd rather save our soul than if he needs to do that, or whatever it's going to take.
Well, and this is what I mean is, he said, I'm the one that made you sick. What I understand 9 years later is I also was making myself sick.
Right.
But if he said that to me, I had no context 9 years ago for what that would even mean.
Right.
I had to start with, he made me sick because that frustrated my theology, and then I had to figure it out theologically. Right. And then I started seeing all these places where God makes all kinds of people sick because they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. And then I was like, oh gosh. And then my counselor's like, I go into counseling, and then years later, counselor's like, well, I think you're making yourself sick. No, I thought God made me. That's how he had to say it, but I don't think it means, people always show up with,
right.
Like when I found out I had cancer, somebody handed me a book by Joel Osteen's mom about prayers to pray against cancer, and I'm not mad at Joel Osteen's mom, but there is an assumption in certain kind of corners of the church,
yes,
where people automatically assume that if you have cancer, it's because you've done something wrong. Right. And that's not true. No. And I'm not saying that.
And that's biblical too, right? Where Job's friends thought that, but they were wrong about Job. Right. And it's always nuanced. And man, things are so complicated, and people just want to put a stamp on it, or, label it because that's easier. Right. But things aren't ever really that simple.
Right. So it's this combination of, you have to hear and obey, which means you have to read the scriptures enough and have a relationship with God enough that you can hear him clearly, which takes a lot of work and a lot of time to understand. Then, as you're hearing God clearly and you're building community around you to check what you're hearing with people in your life that know you and also know God, because you hearing by yourself is always a bad idea, right? We make all kinds of manifestos because we've heard God, and
we
all you
lean
have
on
to
our
do
understanding. Like,
and that's it. All you have to do is ask a close friend, and a close friend just says, "No, I think that's just your fear."
Right.
Well, maybe, but
yeah,
So that's the combination of we have a deep enough relationship with the Lord where we hear Him clearly, and then the longer, harder work is not leaning on your own understanding and interpretation of what the Lord says.
Yeah, and I've done that. I can relate so much to your story, and not that I've had health challenges, excuse me, but I've had a lot of sleep issues in recent years, sleep apnea.
Right.
And it took me a while to figure it out and get diagnosed for it because I had a lower apnea score, essentially API, I think it's called, and so insurance couldn't cover it. Anyways, I finally went to like a Stanford trained ENT, best in the world, whatever, at this ENT surgery. He stuck a camera up my nose, down my throat. It's like, oh, you're a classic case. You're blocked. We can bring you forward. We can bring your jaw forward. And I'm just like, oh, this is it. And not to say, once again, people can't do surgery, whatever. There's not a place for it. But for me, I think God was showing me, I tried everything, dude. I have like 20 different pillows in my room right now.
Right.
I have all the mouth guards. I tried CPAP. I tried surgery now.
Right.
And none of it really worked. There was maybe an incremental increase of something better, but nothing really worked. And then God gave me some healing. Actually, I will go to the whole story like not too long ago. And I'm not perfect now by any means, but God was just same thing. He didn't give me the audible. I didn't hear him say I was sick, but to me it was like what basically he told me was, you haven't been relying on me. You haven't been listening to what I want you to do to get better. Like I've just been trying to figure it out. Okay, I'm supposed to get better, so let me go figure it out, and leaning on my own understanding about it, because I also studied nutrition and all that stuff. So I can be proud in that way and think I can figure something out.
Right.
But the interesting thing is sleep. You can't out eat your way into, you can't diet your sleep better. It's just not, I mean, at least with mine's like an anatomical apnea type thing. So I can't just diet that away.
No, totally. When I've got diverticulitis, there's all these people that gave me books and things of you got to change your eating. And then my doctors were like, those are all old wives' tales. They're not real. Like you can eat popcorn and like, it's not gonna, it's not gonna, but this is part of also not trusting in your own understanding.
Sure.
Is also like, also don't trust in your wife's understanding. Don't trust in your therapist's understanding. Sure. Don't trust in it doesn't mean don't listen.
Right.
You listen to all the voices. Like you have to pay attention. But we all have different things, people, science, whatever the thing is that each of us lean on.
Right.
And you can lean on something too much in your own understanding.
Right. And
totally miss what God is doing. It doesn't mean that God isn't going to use those things to speak, because he does.
He does,
You know, like counseling has been super hard for me and for people around me. And sometimes I come out of counseling thinking, I got it. I'm fixed.
Right.
And I'm not, right? But it's all part of the process of like using what's available to us.
Right.
But in anything, you can lean on the understanding of whatever that thing is, which is the function of idolatry. Like this is why everything in the scripture has to do with what you worship, who you worship, and anything can become idolatry. That you're gonna worship something. Doctors can become that. Therapy can become that. Personality tests can become that. Like everything can become that. It doesn't mean those things are inherently wrong.
Right. It's whatever you put in the place of God that's supposed to be God.
Well, this doctor told me that this is what it is, so that's what it is.
Right.
Well, is he the final word?
Right.
Is she like the final word?
I want to speak on that because, and you brought up Proverbs 3, which I think is perfect because Proverbs 3 is referenced in Hebrews 12, which is talking about responding to God's discipline, right?
Right.
And it says, so right after what you read, it says in verse 11, "My son, do not reject the discipline of the Lord or loathe his reproof, for whom the Lord loves, he reproves, even as a father corrects his son in whom he delights. And there's, depending on the translation, it also says, do not despise his discipline, or do not,
Yep.
there's something about bitterness in there too when he rebukes you.
Yep.
And also, in Hebrews 12, in the context, it talks about, keeping our eyes fixed on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. Because I think there is something, because I think about I love your story. I appreciate you sharing that vulnerably. You in the car with God, you could have not shemad after that, right? You could have gone, okay, I got to figure that out my way, or I'm just going to get bitter because
Right.
why did God make me sick? You could have interpreted it that way instead of really trying to listen and figure out what it is. And I think when I go back to Israel and what we can learn from them, I think that was part of it. Because I wonder, and I want to get your thoughts on this, because it says, in Hebrews 12, Hebrews 3 rather. It says, therefore, just as the Holy Spirit says, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as they provoked
the waters
me.
of Meribah.
Yeah. Well, it's so interesting how it quotes, because I know it's quoting Psalm 95. And if Psalm 95, when you look at that in my translation, it says it correctly, but then in Hebrews, in my translation, it doesn't say the Meribah part. I'm like, why is it? I never know why they don't translate it even within the same translation. Why don't you just carry over correctly? But anyways.
Yeah, I'm sure there's something to that. I don't know off the top of my head, but
because I know the dudes that wrote the New Testament stuff, sometimes they were quoting it a certain way based on, you know what I mean? So it's interesting.
They're quoting the Septuagint, which is a Greek version. The first translation of the Bible out of Hebrew.
Oh, right.
Is into Greek.
Yeah.
Somewhere 200 years before Jesus. So in the Gospels and in the book of Acts, really throughout, they're quoting the Greek, which makes certain
words different.
Yeah.
So, right. So he's quoting Psalm 95. He talks about Meribah and Massa in the wilderness.
Yeah.
And he says, well, your fathers have tested me, tried me, though they had seen my work, right? For 40 years, I loathed that generation and said to they are a people who err in their heart or wander, depending on what word you want to use.
Right.
And therefore I swore in my anger, truly they shall not enter into my
right.
rest. So
when
he said they do not know my ways.
Anytime in Hebrew it says the word for wander, it's Cain.
Right.
Because Cain goes east of Eden to the land of wandering. That's the wilderness is called the land of wandering. So whenever the word wander shows up, it's because you're moving away,
right?
From Eden into not Eden, east of Eden, which is the wilderness, and God's trying to bring us back,
right, to
Eden, which is really right relationship with Him, and that can happen anywhere. But yeah, there's all those hyperlinks keep popping back to all these stories in Hebrew, where it's reflecting back on purpose because the writers of the New Testament are Jews,
right,
in the first century in Judea who speak Greek, but they think like Hebrews, and they're writing for a different worldview in the Greek. Our culture in America comes from Rome and from Greek, from Hellenization. And the New Testament is written right in that world.
Right.
But they're intentionally, as Jews, they're reflecting backwards even in Greek, thinking about Hebrew concepts and ideas that are already thousands of years old for them. That is part of the context. So that idea of discipline and related to bitterness and related to Cain's wandering and related to the desert and the wilderness and all these things is, we have this feeling in the American church like God doesn't do anything to hurt us.
Right.
And it's not true.
Yeah, it's not biblical.
But He doesn't, it's not punitive.
Right.
God's not hurting us to hurt us.
It's a father.
He's not because He enjoys it, not because He loves it. I mean, I'm watching this as a dad with, I have 3 teenagers, and one is in college and, on our way out of the house, it's really hard to watch them go their own way. They have to.
Right.
And they have to be independent enough that they're gonna do things different than how we taught them to do it. And part of the relationship with free will is we have to let them. As a father, I don't want my kids to ever be hurt. I don't want anyone to hurt them. I don't want them to experience pain. But they have to. And in most cases, I think the point of the pain is if something hurts bad enough, and there are remnants of the pain that last, it's in part so you don't do it again.
Right.
Right? I don't want to fall into... So they have to find... they can't just live off of the hurt that we've experienced as their parents and the things we're trying to protect them from. And what happens as parents is we are afraid for our children. But the Lord keeps saying, don't be afraid. Okay, but they're going to get hurt. I know. And
Right.
I'll work through all of those things to bring them back to myself. But it's but I want it to be faster.
Yeah.
I want them to be safe, and I want them to be healthy.
Right.
And, so there is this relationship where, different people come from different theological backgrounds and experiences and how they were taught to understand these things. So I want to be sensitive to where people are coming from. But this idea that God only disciplines who he loves is... that's a heavy...
That's deep.
That's Tim Mackey always says, that's that needs a cup of tea and a long walk.
Yeah.
To meditate on the idea that, okay, there's probably things in my life that are a father disciplining his son.
Right.
And like a son, I'm probably rebelling against the discipline.
Right.
So where is that happening?
And that's where it says endure, it says endure suffering or hardship as discipline. God's treating you as sons. And it's it's hard to see our suffering like that.
Well,
because
we're also American, right?
Oh,
so
yeah.
Suffering for us is
it's an inconvenience to the pursuit of happiness and all these things.
They keep making my coffee wrong at Starbucks.
yeah.
I'm suffering for the gospel.
Right. It's so ridiculous. Well, which is why we have such a hard time, which is why I think this podcast is so important, because I think people need to learn these things that you're talking about. They maybe didn't grow up with that worldview, but that doesn't mean that they don't need to learn it, because it's going to help them through, because, what is it? 1 in 3 people get cancer now or something? It's, people are going to go through, or you're going to know someone. In fact, you are for sure going to know everyone in your life you're going to lose them at some point. So it's we need to know how to deal with this. And the Bible tells us, and I think if we have the wrong theology or the wrong idea, or we don't understand it, then we're going to suffer more, I think, because we're not understanding it, right? We're misinterpreting
Well, right,
it.
because that's the point of Hebrews 12 and Proverbs 3 and all the things we're talking about is the more you shema,
yes,
and do not lean on your own understanding,
right,
the easier it gets to trust. The goal is faster.
Yeah.
Is,
you wouldn't need to do we don't need to do the 40 in the wilderness.
I want to realize that I'm afraid because of something I'm seeing with my eyes. Yeah. And then I want to step back and go, okay, I'm afraid of what I see. But I also know that you're the God who took us out of Egypt.
Right.
And you're the God who has done all the things that you have done. And your promise is to never leave me or forsake me. So can you give me the patience to wait, to see what you do, to pay attention to what you're saying, do all the things that I'm supposed to do, but also give me the patience to wait, because it's going to take way longer than I want it to do.